Welcome back to the podcast, you guys. Today we are hanging out with Abigail, and she's going to be taking us through this series of the honeybees. And she shared this recently at our mother-daughter banquet, and it was a really great devotional to go through, very challenging and also very fun. If you weren't aware, Abigail works on her family honeybee farm, and so she has lots of insider information into the honeybees. And I think it's a very interesting and intriguing conversation, and so she's going to dive into it for us.
Yeah, so we're going to talk through the 3 different roles in the hive. The first lesson that we're going to find is on the lesson of the queen bee. And maybe I can quiz Cassidy because now she's listened to this once. The next lesson is going to be on the worker bee. And the final lesson will be on the drone bee. So the queen bee is the only one of her kind in the hive. She's the only queen. She is the only one that is able to lay eggs and produce worker bees. She has to go out after she hatches, and she goes on a mating flight. Do you remember how many drones she has to mate with?
Is it like 7 or is it more 17? Like, remember it was...
Yep, it is from 12 to 17 drones that they have to mate with. And this is what really then establishes their ability to lay for the rest of their life. And that is then able to sustain the hive. The queen is reared from an ordinary worker larva, which is so cool. And the bees then are able to create a cell that is actually of a cylinder size. It's not hexagonal like a regular worker bee or even like a drone would grow in. And then they also feed her a special diet of royal jelly. And that gives her the ability to then grow into a queen bee. Next, we talk about the worker bee. And there's anywhere from 12 to 60,000 bees in a single colony, in a single hive. And throughout a worker bee's short life, she's going to transition to very many different duties and tasks. And she lives a life of transition. Then we get to the drone bee, and the drones are the only males in the hive. And there might only be a couple hundred drones in the hive at the peak of season, and then that number starts to dwindle. The drone's only task is to mate with the queen, and not every drone gets that opportunity. So for the drones who make it into the fall, as the months start to get cooler, unfortunately, they get kicked out of the hive. They are not welcome anymore. During the summer, the bees will put up with them, all of their eating and
little
sleeping.
Moochers.
Yes, yep. And then after that, it's out of the hive because they don't do any other labor. So lesson 1, the queen bee. The queen bee is unique. And there's not very many queens in the bee world. We know that there's only one queen to every hive, and so that's roughly 1 to every 80,000 bees is going to be a queen. Most around her are workers, and they're busily going from one task to the next, and they're switching seasons. She does not switch on a whim. The queen is consistent, she's reliable, you know where to find her. She doesn't get to experience all of these different changing seasons. She stays steady in her work. She's consistent in that work. She's disciplined and does not grow weary in well-doing. The queen remains in her role for what might seem like an eternity. And the lifespan of a honeybee, the worker bee on average, is about 35 days.
Wow.
A queen bee can live up to 5 years.
Wow.
So especially when you view it in that context, she's constantly seeing change around her, but she's required to remain the same. She gets to watch all of her daughters go from a nurse bee to an architect to a forager to a cleaner to a guard, and all that while she remains the same. There might be some of you who are listening, and you might be surprised to find that you actually identify with a queen bee. That sounds really familiar to you in the stage of life that you're in, or have been in for a very long time. Maybe you've been doing the same career or the same work for 30 years, and you're feeling like, I wish that I could retire, or I wish that I could be a stay-at-home mom. Or maybe you've been a stay-at-home mom for 20 years, 25 years, and you just feel like, I'm tired. Maybe you've looked around and you've seen other women get these experiences and you've missed out on them. You see other women that are getting exciting new milestones, and it feels like you've been at the same milestone for a long time with no change. Perhaps you even feel a little bit bossed around as everyone expects you to be in this role. No, queen, just go lay your eggs. Stop trying to come over here. That's your job. And nobody offers to help you. Nobody sympathizes with you. They just expect you to keep on keeping on. And that can be a really discouraging feeling. But I want to offer a few different words of encouragement as we talk about the queen bee and the example that she can be to us. Number one is that your role is not to be taken lightly. How often do we undervalue ourselves? Can you think of times where maybe people look at their roles and say, it's not that big of a deal?
Oh, I just talked about this in our faithful and our motherhood conversation, that sometimes we will call ourselves just a mom because, there's nothing really big, extraordinary here. And that's not true.
Right. Absolutely. There's value. And, at times you might feel unappreciated. The work that God has equipped you specifically with, whether it's at your home or whether it's in your job, or if you're a single woman, or if you're a caretaker, or maybe you're disabled, God, just as he equips the queen and just as he gives her special abilities and her intellect and her skill to do it, he's equipped you that same way and has said, you know what? Not very many women take this route, but this is where I want you to be. So there's not very many queens in the world, but those that are out there are highly valuable and they're vital to the success of the hive. Before we go to our next point, I'm going to interject real quick and just say that this point might not translate from bee world to human world perfectly. So don't take this too literally. Just as the worker bee has to become her new role every time her season changes, well, so must the queen bee to an extent. When she hatches from her cell, she's unmated. She's a virgin. And in the human world, this is a praiseworthy thing and a virtuous thing to be a virgin. It's not so much in the bee world. In the bee world, it's very unhelpful for the queen to be unmated, and oftentimes it can be her detriment to be unmated. So the virgin queen has to leave the hive and she has to go to mate with
17 or 12.
Yeah, 12 to 17 drone. And then she has to come back and she has to learn a proper egg laying pattern, and she has to get it just so. Now, if she doesn't mate with enough drones, it might mean that she won't be able to continue laying for her entire reign. She might stop short, and then they'll have to raise up a new queen to take her place. That could be devastating. So a few things here. Some would-be queens, they never mature. They never take flight. And they end up being removed from their position. Some do take flight, but they don't complete the task fully. Maybe they only mate with 5 drones or 6 drones, and then they say, this is good enough. They do a halfway job, and that results in a poor laying pattern. It results in not having enough eggs, and it's ultimately going to result in a short reign where the bees will say, hey, you're not doing what you're supposed to, and they'll remove her from the hive. Some do return back to the hive, but then they never learn the correct laying pattern. They've mated with the right amount of drones. They've done those previous steps, but then they stop short. They never perfect the role that God has called them to. This incomplete work and failure to truly become results in one of two things, and both of them are devastating. One of the things that could happen to a queen bee that doesn't become is that her reign is cut short. The bees recognize that she's not doing a good job, and they'll end up raising a new queen, and then that virgin will actually go and kill her, and they'll remove her body from the hive. The second thing that can happen in that situation is that maybe the bees don't really notice it. The hive becomes a little bit passive, and slowly the numbers begin to dwindle, and all around her hive is dying. Those are terrible things that could happen. So don't assume that if you have found yourself in this queen bee role, that you have arrived and that you've got nothing more to become. You may find that there's still unfinished business to attend to.
God's word tells us in Galatians 6:9, "And let us not be weary in well-doing, for in due season we shall reap, if we faint not." Hebrews 12:3, "For consider him that endured such contradiction of sinners against himself, lest he be wearied and faint in your minds." Isaiah 40:31, "But they that wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings as eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not be faint." And 2 Thessalonians 3:13, "But ye brethren, be not weary in well-doing."
Yeah. So the Bible has a lot to say about perseverance and endurance. And definitely if you're in that queen bee season, that might be for you. So that brings us to lesson number 2, the worker bee. We've already talked about this a little bit on the podcast. We had a previous episode. I don't remember what it's called.
Season 1, like lessons we can learn from the honeybee.
Yeah, something like that. And I really, in that one, just focused on the worker bee. But on days 1 through 3 of a honeybee's life, so this is review for those of you who have listened. You can quiz yourself. How much do you remember, if anything? You're like, nothing. On days 1 through 3 of a honeybee's life, they function as the nurse or the cleaning bees, and they're starting to clean the cells and prep it for the queen bee before she lays. And then days 4 through 11, they begin feeding the other little larvae, and they're the nurse bees, and they're going through from one little cell to the next cell, making sure that those larvae are ready. And then days 11 through 14, they become the architects of the hive. And this is really cool. There's this change in their body where their wax glands have developed, and now they're able to start producing wax for building up the cells, or if something has been broken, they're able to repair it. And they weren't able to do that on day 4 or on day 5 or day 6 or 7. That development begins on day 10. And then, roughly then days 15 through 21, she begins foraging for pollen. And again, those are new glands that begin to develop, a new part of her body that is prepared for the task. She'll go out and she's only collecting the pollen for the hive. And then days 22 and forward, she'll begin foraging for nectar. And nectar is really what makes the honey. So they'll bring the nectar back, and then they're able to add little enzymes to it. And they're also able to dehydrate it. And it's cool. They dehydrate the honey by flapping their wings.
So cool.
And that draws out the moisture from it, and it goes from nectar to honey.
Yeah, this whole time talking about the bee, I'm just so amazed at the creator being so creative and making the bees exactly for these specific jobs and to change and be what they need to be in the hive. It's so beautiful.
Right. I mean, it's so cool when you look at God, and, he's this creator, but he's a scientist, and he really has a science to this, and he brings it down and looks at, how long are they going to live for, and what is going to be most productive for the hive, And how will they be able to sustain? It's very, very different than the idea of evolution of, well, it just kind of happened and it worked out somehow.
It's very intentional design by the creator.
And that is ultimately where we're going to find in our own correlation to this is God is so intentional. Every season that we go through, it's intentional. You know, he designed us to move through that. So the honeybee lives a life of change. She doesn't remain in the same place. She doesn't get to do the same task her entire life. She continues to move forward and she has to lay aside what she knew. She might have been really comfortable being a nurse bee, or maybe she doesn't really like having to work with a larva and she preferred just being a cleaner bee. But whether she likes it or not, she moves forward to the next task. Some stages in the worker bee's life last longer than the others. We talked about how the very first stage in her life is only 3 days versus her final stage of being a forager and guarding the hive. That's almost 20 days, depending on how long she lives for. So she assesses what her abilities are and she moves on to the next task that her designer has equipped her for. The honeybee is virtuous and efficient. Would you read our next verse for us, Cassidy?
Yes, it's from Isaiah 43:19, and it says, "Behold, I will do a new thing. Now it shall spring forth. Shall you not know it? I will even make a way in the wilderness and rivers in the desert."
Yeah, so something that seemed totally impossible. You know, how can it be that there is, suddenly this path in the wilderness? We're getting a little off track, but if you've ever driven through Tennessee and the mountains, I would have hated to be the people who had to make those roads because they had to blast out the mountains and then they, chiseled I don't know how they did it. But that's the idea here, is that God is making a way in a wilderness that seems unpassable. And then rivers in a desert. And that's exactly what he does. This bee who couldn't produce any wax, suddenly on day 11, it's developed and this new thing has started. And that same thing is for you and I. Realistically, a honeybee probably does not have a favorite season. She probably does not have a favorite job. But I do know that as women, we do have favorites. We have things that we really love to do. And you know what? There's things that God calls us to that are really hard, that are really challenging and painful. And, it can be hard to let go of a past freedom or past status. And I don't know, Cassidy, if you experienced that or if you've so far found your transitions pretty joyful. How have you felt?
I think that through transition seasons, in my mind, it always feels a little bit tentative because it's uncomfortable to go from one thing to the next. And then in your brain, you're trying to work out between you and God, like, do I trust you, God? Yes, I do trust you. And that's kind of been the theme of my transitions, even from the beginning into marriage, is there's a lot to learn and it can be daunting.
Yeah, it can be daunting, and again, more than that, it can be really painful at times depending on what your transition is. There's a woman at our church and she had a career that she loved and she got sick, and overnight she lost her career. Wow. It was done. It was gone. And I just think, wow, I can't imagine, but that was a transition that God called her to. And, we might be looking at some of these transitions in our lives or changes or, losses, and we might be tempted to question God. Why are you calling me to move forward? And we might be tempted to resent the season that we have. Cassidy, would you read our next verse?
Yeah, it's from Jeremiah 29:11. "For I know the thoughts that I think toward you, says the Lord, thoughts of peace and not of evil, to give you an expected end."
Yeah, we lose sight of that. God has a plan. And despite how painful some things may feel, the thoughts of peace. We've talked about how other seasons are really exciting and we can't wait to step into it. And those are really easy to see. Oh yeah, God has thoughts of of peace, and he's giving me an expected end. But through any of those, the good, the bad, the ugly, he wants us to become more like him, just as the honeybee becomes the professional in her role. As the queen bee has to become the professional in her role. As long as it may last, she's an expert in it, and no one can do the job quite like she does. That's how God wants us to be. Whether you're a queen bee or whether you're a worker bee, he wants us to really take that role and use it for his honor and glory. He wants us to serve him in every season, not just our favorite. So he calls us to be content where he has us, to be obedient to his word, to be joyful in season and out of season. And this can be hard. It can be very hard to be joyful in a painful season. It can be hard to be joyful in a boring season, you know. The reality is sometimes the seasons that we're in are just kind of boring. You know, not bad, but just boring. And God says, no, be excited, you know, worship me, praise me in this. So our final three, we have a total of 4 lessons for the worker bee. So we did 1 and 2, and now we're going to talk about lessons 3 and 4 from the worker bee. Why don't you go ahead and you can read our points for us?
Yeah, so point 3 is the honeybee built her home with her wax glands. Proverbs 14:1. Every wise woman buildeth her house, but the foolish plucketh it down with her hands. And our 4th point here is that the honeybee tears down the queen cells that don't belong, as it can threaten the good queen. 2 Corinthians 10:4 says, For the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty through God to the pulling down of strongholds.
Yeah, so to this point number 3, the honeybee builds her home with her wax glands. She really does that. She assesses, oh, hey, we have a problem, and she builds it back up. The verse that we had was Proverbs 14:1, talking about the wise woman, of how she builds up her home. But the flip side of that is a foolish woman tears it down. You know, Cassidy, could you think of some ways that a foolish woman might inadvertently tear down her home?
I think a lot has to do with our words, our attitude.
Attitudes, yeah, that's a good one too.
And in relation to your husband is often connected to your home. And you can easily tear it down with a disrespectful attitude towards your husband. Yeah. And trying to say, I'm in charge, I'm going to call the shots. And that's not the order that God has for it. So it will easily tear down a home.
Yeah. And it can be devastating. And, you know, that attitude, we can see that in the workplace. We can see that in churches where little attitudes come in, and little by little, it starts to tear everything down. You know, may that not be said of us. You know, I hope that we can be identified as the wise women who are building and enriching our homes. Then we kind of have the flip side of this, of there might be a time to tear down. We see that the honeybee will actually tear down queen cells. So where a potential queen bee might hatch and out would come a virgin, the worker bees will tear that down because they know, no, we have a good queen. We don't want this virgin to hatch and kill our productive queen. That could be devastating for our hive. Well, in our own lives, the Bible tells us, hey, pull down the strongholds through God. You know, there is carnal warfare that's going on in our life. There's these wicked imaginations that are coming into our hearts. Tear it down. Yes. Get rid of it. And that stronghold, like Cassidy said, that might be a seed of bitterness or a seed of disrespect. That's really something that can destroy families, and we've seen it many, many times. We'll see that in churches as well. And so my question is there something in your home or in your life that you need to tear down? You need to get it out of there, maybe a thought pattern or habit pattern. God calls, hey, get rid of that.
Maybe even a pattern of laziness, my friends.
Yes, a pattern of laziness, which is going to bring us into perfectly.
Oh,
that was,
wow.
yeah, perfect. See, I thought you did that on purpose.
No, that was, nope.
Wow. Yes, that brings us perfectly into lesson 3 on the drone. So, again, I'm going to start this off by saying it is not a perfect illustration.
You mean you're not male bees?
Yeah. This is not a perfect illustration from the bee world to the human world. The bee world is pretty brutal. And I'm not saying that we should treat humans the way that bees
discard the moochers.
Yeah. Don't treat humans the way that the bees treat each other with killing and
So
removal.
violent.
Yes. But there are some loose applications that we can definitely make from the drone. Cassidy, do you remember what happens to the drone who does not fulfill his duty?
What is it? He just gets kicked out.
Yeah, he gets booted out of the hive.
Yeah.
See you later. So it's unfortunate to think about, but everybody in the hive has a job. The drone's job is to mate with the queen. That's it. But not every drone gets to do that. And so for the drones who don't, they really just sit around the hive. They'll go out on their mating flight, or try to. They'll look for a queen. Maybe they'll do that a couple times a day. But then they'll come back to the hive and they'll just eat. And they'll kind of buzz around, and that's it. So during the winter months, the hive does not tolerate a slacker. During the summer, when there's lots of supplies, lots of food, they'll say, okay, fine, whatever. You came back today, I see. I see that you didn't find work again. And they'll tolerate him. But then once the winter comes and the food supplies get really short, they'll remove all of the drones from the hive. The bees do not allow slackers to hang around and mooch off of them. But what's sort of unfortunate is that the drones aren't the only ones who get kicked out. Like I alluded to already, sometimes the queen is kicked out if she's not able to fulfill her duty. Maybe the bees feel like you've slacked off, or you never went out and mated. This was your one job. Sometimes a virgin is kicked out for freeloading off the hive and allowing their numbers to dwindle. Other times, robber bees or intruder bees will come in.
Hey, so sorry to pause in the middle here, but my kiddos are going to need me, so I'm going to scooch out while Abigail finishes up her episode. Thanks so much, Abigail.
Yep. Cassidy is transitioning to her work that needs to be done. No slacker. Sometimes we'll see that, especially when the crop is not doing well and the harvest is low, that intruder bees or robber bees will come in and they'll start to try to steal all their supplies. They'll be identified and kicked out or killed. Sometimes a rogue honeybee who's taken matters into her own hands, she'll become a laying worker and she will be thrown out of the hive if the bees find her. So our lesson from the drone then is that the honeybees run a tight ship. This is by God's design. Which having no guide, overseer, or ruler provideth her meat in the summer and gathereth her food in the harvest. Proverbs 6:7-8. Remember that each one of us have a purpose. God has given us a task that he wants us to complete. So might I encourage you that regardless of what season you're in, take it seriously. Become an expert in that field. Become a professional in that field. Be the best that you can be. Oftentimes we get so comfortable in our roles, or we become so overwhelmed in our roles that we feel like we're scatterbrained and we're everywhere and we just are too worn thin. But God calls us to be, to rest in him, to seek after him. Maybe you're just bored in your role, or you don't like your role and you resent it. God has called us to a stage. It might be temporary. Some of these stages and roles that he has for us last a long time, and other ones are really short. So obey him and do the best that you can. You know, the bees are this incredible example to us. Paul reminds us that God uses the foolish things of the world to confound the wise. And surely we see that with the bees. You know, what is a honeybee doing? Teaching me, a human. What right does the honeybee have to tout her obedience over my disobedience? But that is just the wonder of God's design and his creation. I just have some really quick bonus lessons here. I alluded to a laying worker or a queen bee wannabe. The laying worker is a regular worker bee, and she gets the notion in her head that she wants to be the queen. She wants to start laying eggs. Now, what's interesting is that she actually does lay eggs. Her body is able to produce eggs, and unfortunately, they turn into something. They don't turn into worker bees. They turn into lazy drone bees. Hungry, lazy drones. Now, for a hive that's not able to stop the laying workers, what will happen is the drones will take over the hive, and suddenly the number of worker bees dwindles and dwindles until all that's left is a hive full of hungry, unskilled drones. This is devastating to a hive. Here we have a worker bee who's tried to be something that she's not. This worker bee has tried to take on a role and become something that she was never intended to. As women, sometimes we do this. We try to become something that God never called us to be. You know, be content in the role that you have. Don't try to manipulate circumstances and situations that can be devastating, not just to yourself, but also to those who are around you. Our next point here as we wrap up is that some would-be queens never mature. We've touched on this. They never go out to mate. They don't help the hive. Instead, sometimes what happens is they provide this false sense of hope and this false sense of security in the hive, but they stand by as, again, the colony dies, because the numbers aren't being replaced by a queen. Are you in a role where you're just half-hearted? You're not doing what God has called you to, and maybe you're not maturing in that role. I alluded earlier to becoming a professional in whatever it is that you do. Strive to be the best that you can, not just for others, not just for yourself, but ultimately for God. God calls us that whatever you do, do all for his glory. And then the last thing, and this was actually something that I had learned in preparation, was that honeybees spend a good amount of time in rest. And this might sound contradictory to the other points that I had made about, don't be a slacker and don't be lazy. But as women, sometimes we try to keep ourselves overly busy, and we try to prove our worth in what we're accomplishing. But when we look at the honeybees, we find that much of their time is spent in rest. It might be an active rest where they're communicating with the other bees, but they allow their bodies time to rest. And as women, this is something that's also important for us, and certainly refreshing our minds and our hearts in God's word. So in conclusion, whether you are eagerly looking forward to the change of roles, and maybe you're thriving in this stage of life that God has blessed you with, or maybe you're stepping out apprehensively or even regrettably into a new role, remember that God doesn't want us to remain the same, but he wants us to continue growing. Even if you're a queen bee, he still calls us to grow. He has a new work for us to faithfully complete. So I hope that this was a little bit of an encouragement to you. My prayer is that you can find some just inspiration from the honeybee and how she works and how we can apply that into our own life. Cassidy was able to swoop back in and rescue us for Song of the Week.
Yeah, so as we were in the middle of talking about the queen bee, we were talking about her steadfastness. It's kind of what I think that matched up pretty good with. And the song kept going through my mind. It's called Steadfast by Jeff Lawson. And I really appreciated the reminder of be steadfast, oh my soul. And that is kind of what I had. So yes,
All right.
there's your Sound
Thank
of
you.
the Week. We're excited to see you guys next time.
Bye.